Hey music fans, this is Peter Scove from Music is a Journey. Welcome to another episode. I've got the moose behind me, which means today's topic is going to be about Canadian music, and this time I'm going to be taking a look at music in the 1960s. This video will be in two parts because when I first planned on making this video, I wanted to talk about the 8 bands or so whose recordings I already had on CD. However, as I began researching what was going on in the 1960s in Canadian music, I found that there were a few other bands I really wanted to check out as well, and some of their music was quite good, and I've since ordered some albums. So what I've decided to do was talk about the bands I already am familiar with in this first video, and then as the CDs come in and I have a chance to listen to some of the other ones, I will make a part 2 to this video a little bit later on. One of the interesting things I found as I was digging into what was going on in the music scene was that 1970 seems to have been a kind of barrier or a kind of transition point. By that I mean a lot of the bands that formed in the mid-60s, or perhaps even a little bit earlier, a little bit later, managed to exist up until about 1970. Of course, some of them quit 68, 69, but a lot of them made it up to 1970, and then after that, they stopped. They might have put out an album or two, and 1970, a couple of them made it to 71, but basically 70 was the magic year where a lot of bands just ended. And then the interesting thing is that a lot of the bands from the 60s that made it up to about 1959, 1970, they went through a lineup change, a style change, and even a name change, and then continued on as a new band from about 1971 and onwards. Of course, there were some bands that actually managed to carry on through to the 1970s, and even some that started in the very late 60s, like 68, 69, and then managed to carry over until about like 72, 73, 74. So it wasn't as if everybody hit a dead wall at 1970, but it was fairly common. Anyway, I've got 8 bands to talk about today, so let's get on with the first one. When you move in right up close to me. First up, let's talk about the Guess Who. Probably one of Canada's most well-known bands, and certainly the first Canadian band to really make it big outside of Canadian borders. The Guess Who originally started out as Alan and the Silvertones back in 1959-1960, and in 1962 they acquired Gary Peterson on drums and Randy Bachman on guitars, and around this time they changed the name to Chad Allen and the Reflections. However, sometime after that, an American band called the Reflections actually managed to get a song on the charts, and so they changed their name to Chad Allen and the Expressions. Now, they were from Winnipeg, Canada, and they were very popular locally, but they were having a hard time getting that hit across the country. As far as the local scene goes, actually an interesting thing, a former girlfriend of mine from way back when, her mother actually grew up in Winnipeg in the early 1960s, and she remembers seeing Chad Allen and the Expressions performing on the roof of a bowling alley while all the kids were out in the parking lot cheering. She said that was a really memorable performance. Well, trying to get that elusive #1 hit, in 1964, December of 64, the band decided to do a cover of Johnny Kidd and the Pirates' 1960 hit, Shakin' All Over. So they went to a television studio where they recorded the song. And the problem was that they had just done a show a couple of hours before, and vocalist Chad Allen had been singing with a sore throat, so his vocals were in terrible shape. Also, they had only one microphone and only one amp, so Randy Bachman and bassist Jim Vale both plugged into Jim Vale's bass amp. Chad Allen just laid down on the floor with the microphone overhead, and then the band just played into the one mic. Now, they also had only 2 jacks for recording and for playback, so each time they wanted to listen to what they'd recorded, they had to take out the jacks, plug them into the playback system, playback speakers. And one time, something happened and they got this weird echoey slapback sound, and everybody was just like, that's it, that's what we want, that sounds like Elvis. So in January of 1965 they released their single of Shakin' All Over, and it became a #1 hit across the country. As a marketing scheme, however, they didn't send the album out as Chad Allen and the Expressions. They put a label over top that said, Guess Who? And of course radio DJs all over were going, who is this English band? Because around that time, a lot of Canadian bands found it very difficult to make it big, partly because radio DJs of the bigger stations wanted to hear the latest sounds from the US or the latest sounds from the UK. So local bands, they just weren't getting the attention they deserved. Well, here they were, guess who? Some great English band, wow! And of course, later the cat was out of the bag, it was Chad Allen and the Expressions. However, DJs started referring to them as Guess Who, and so they officially changed their name to The Guess Who, which the band didn't really like, but anyway, it seemed to be working for them. Sometime after that, a young Burton Cummings joined the band to take over lead vocals and play keyboard as well. And then soon after that, Chad Allen left the band altogether and went to work for the CBC. The band continued to have some success, and they actually even got a song on the charts in the UK, and they thought this is a great time to promote it. And so overseas they went and returned to Canada heavily in debt. The band managed to secure a spot as the house band for the CBC program Let's Go, partly thanks to Chad Allen, who was now working with the CBC. But in 1968, they thought we really need to do something, and they had a change in management, and from there on, the band's fortunes really looked up. They had Wheatfield Soul, I think it is, Wheatfield Soul, Canned Wheat, and then American Woman in 1970, and of course, that basically launched them into a big-time band. But also around this time, the magic year 1970, Randy Bachman decided to leave the band, and he started up a band called Brave Belt with Chad Allen. But then later on, after some more changes, he started up BTO, Bachman Turner Overdrive, which actually also turned out to be a really great big band out of Canada. But there you go, the Guess Who. And one more interesting thing I want to add is that the new manager from 1968, Don Hunter, after the band folded in the mid-1970s, Don Hunter went on to be a farmer, and then later on got into dog breeding and then pet nutrition, and he became the representative of a pet food company. Now, in the 1990s, I worked for a pet food and supply warehouse, and one day, one of the guys I worked with said, Don Hunter is coming in today. He is the former manager of the Guess Who. And I thought, why is the former manager of the Guess Who being a representative, working as a representative for a dog food company? But anyway, there he was. Don Hunter came in, short guy, very rotund around the middle, no hair on the top of his head, and for some reason I always remember him standing with a briefcase in the left hand and a styrofoam cup of coffee in the right hand. So anyway, he loved to talk about dogs and breeding animals and pets and pet nutrition and all that, but if you asked him, he would also happily talk about what was happening in the Canadian music scene in the 1960s and early 70s. Very sadly, Don Hunter passed away in 2019. I think he was 73, but he's fondly remembered by his wife, kids, and the people who knew him. I think I was kind of lucky I got to meet him myself. Alright, this album here, this is the Guess Who Shaken All Over. It is a collection of songs from up to just before the management change. So these are the singles and some of the album tracks, I guess, also by Chad Allen and the Expressions, the Guess Who in the 1960s. Of course, Shaken All Over is on here. Some other really cool tracks, It's My Pride, where they actually plugged Jim Vale's bass into Randy Bachman's fuzz box. So we've got a lead riff on bass with fuzz tone and a bass solo, and then another song called 7 Long Years, which is about this guy who's working away on the hard rock pile and he's wishing he could get to San Francisco and have freedom. But in the middle, there is this one part where the guitar starts rumbling and the drums come in and then the guitar chords are crashing down and Burton Cummings is practically screaming out the lyrics. Really hard-hitting stuff. Sounds great. And a lot of other cool tracks on here too. So there we go, the Guess Who. Let's move on to the next band, Steppenwolf. So Steppenwolf's origins start with a guy named Jack London, who was an immigrant from the UK, and he started up a band called Jack London and the Sparrows. They released some singles, then they had a lineup change, they brought in some people like Jerry Edmonton, Goldie McJohn, and John Kay. And around this time then they recorded an album. However, Jack London arranged for most of the album recording, and he also arranged for most of the royalties to go to him, so the rest of the band were not particularly pleased about that and decided to separate themselves from him, and they went off as the Sparrows for a short time. The Sparrows managed to get some attention stateside, and they went down to New York, and then finally they went off to California. However, during this time, some of the members left, and we were left with 3 Canadians, John Kay, Goldie McJohn, and Jerry Edmonton. Another member from Canada, Nick St. Nicholas, he left the band for a short time and started up another band called Time, Trust in Men Everywhere. And the other 3 members came to see him perform one time, and they said, you know, you really got to come back into the band. Also, they hired an American guitarist named, well, his stage name was Mars Bonfire, which is a pretty cool name. And then they decided to change their name to Steppenwolf after the Hermann Hesse novel of 1928. And in January of 1968, they released their debut album, Steppenwolf, with the hit song Born to be Wild. January 1968 was also a pretty cool month for proto-metal because it was also the month that Iron Butterfly released their debut album, Heavy, and Blue Cheer released their debut album, Vincebus Eruptum. Now, of course, the debut album of Steppenwolf featured Born to be Wild, which was not only a big hit song, but is often brought up because it includes the lyric heavy metal. However, it is, in this case, referring to the engine of the motorcycle as the rider is roaring off down a desert highway and feeling that heavy metal of the engine rumbling beneath him. Anyway, Steppenwolf, they continued on a big success. They had their second album with Magic Carpet Ride, and in fact the band released several albums right up until the mid-1970s when they finally split apart for a little while, and in total they've released 13 studio albums, the last one being in 1990. Last I read, the band had performed in 2019, although it is basically led by John Kay as I think I have it. Anyway, Steppenwolf, one of those big bands. I didn't really think of them so much as a Canadian band because they basically went stateside and recruited American members as well. But fact is, their roots are from Canada. All right, our next band is going to be The Haunted. Hold on. I'm coming. The Haunted were a band from Montreal that formed in 1965, and the members of The Haunted grew up listening to the same music as a lot of the British musicians did, and so they cut their chops on those American blues artists. So they had that kind of similar background. They formed in 1965, and then in 1966, they won a Battle of the Bands contest with their song 125, which is a song about a guy who's walking late at night, encounters a hooker, and there's also some mention of Mary Jane. So this song here, even though it became a hit for the band, they actually had to re-record it for Canadian radio because the lyrics were just a little bit too spicy. Interestingly enough, the original version was accepted stateside. Usually it's the other way around. But anyway, The Haunted became a pretty popular act, actually quite a popular act. They were getting booked for gigs across the country, and it's said that when the band actually folded around 71, they actually had to cancel a year's worth of bookings and paid a heck of a lot in legal fees to get out of those contracts. The band played a style of basically blues-based but kind of aggressive, gritty garage rock style, as well as some blues and psychedelic, and on this collection of songs here too there are some more lighter tracks as well. I think for this one here most of the masters seem to have come from vinyl discs because it just has that sound and there's a bit of scratchiness and so on. I don't think it is a nice clean remaster like with the Steppenwolf album, which sounds great. But anyway, a good raunchy rock and roll on here, some really great stuff. And some interesting thing here, the band's final single was a cover of Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix, and in spite of being an Anglophone band, they actually wrote the lyrics in French, and the song was called Vapeur Mauve. And so that's what they sang, Vapeur Mauve. They also covered the Music Machine's 1966 garage hit Talk Talk, which again they changed to French, and it is called Pourquoi on here. This is a pretty good rockin' album, at least some of the songs. If you really like that gritty garage rock or that, 60s blues or whatever, or this is a pretty cool album to get a hold of. Okay, that's The Haunted, and next up we're going to check out some Ugly Ducklings. The The Ugly Ducklings were another Toronto band. They were big in the Yorkville scene in the late 1960s in Toronto. They formed in 1966 originally as a Stones cover band called the Strolling Bones. However, they then started recording their own original material, and they had some singles out in 1966, and I think finally singles and some songs ended up on a 1967 album called Somewhere Outside. Incidentally, the band also opened for the Rolling Stones in 1966 at Maple Leaf Gardens, and it's also been said that around that time, the Ugly Ducklings were Mick Jagger's favorite Canadian band. The band's sound was, again, blues-based, very similar to the Stones, but still with a bit more of a garage edge to it in some cases here. One of their cover songs, Hey Mama, Keep Your Big Mouth Shut, just seems to really have that garage rock angst to it. There was a lineup change and a sound change, and they released a few more songs in 1968. One of them, called Gaslight, made it on the charts across Canada, hit the #1 spot on Chum Radio in Toronto, and actually knocked the Rolling Stones off the #1 position with that song. The band eventually split up after that. However, the vocalist and harmonica player, Dave Bingham, he actually wrote a book about his experiences with the Ugly Ducklings and the Toronto music scene in the 1960s. It's called Noise from the North End. I've got 2 albums here. One of them, Somewhere Outside, and the other one is an Ugly Ducklings compilation of songs, some of them from here, some of them other singles, and including Gaslight as well. Apparently, though, it is not the original single version of Gaslight that I have on here, but I don't really mind so much. It's okay. You can find the Ugly Ducklings on Spotify because, as I understand it, Mr. Bingham uploaded all the band's catalog to Spotify a couple of years back. So you might want to check out these ugly boys. All right, we are moving along now to A Plastic Cloud in the Sky. The Plastic Cloud were a band that formed in Bay Ridges, Ontario. They were heavily inspired by the Byrds in the beginning, that kind of electric folk rock style. However, they started to change their sound more to that fuzzy, heavy psychedelic sound, closer to what Jefferson Airplane were doing, if I may make a comparison there. By the time they finally recorded an album in 1968, the album was more or less split, 8 tracks, half of them that electric folk sound and the other half that fuzzy psychedelic sound. 2 of the tracks on here are actually quite long. One of them is over 8 minutes, the other one over 10 minutes. And if you're a prog fan, your ears might suddenly perk up like, hey, 8 minutes, 10 minutes long? What are they doing? Well, as it turned out, the 10-minute long song mostly just has an extended instrumental break in it. The song doesn't really develop in the way that you would imagine a prog rock song of the 1970s developing. And the other one hasn't really, the chorus is just played out for a long time near the end, and then there's a nuclear explosion, and then some ominous organ signifying the end of the world. The Plastic Cloud's one album here, though, does get a lot of praise by reviews out there, saying that this is like a lost, heavy psychedelic gem. And I have a quote written down here. It's a quote from a website called Light in the Attic, and very shortly it says, Plastic Cloud recorded, quite simply, one of the greatest underground psychedelic albums ever made. There it is. So if you want to check it out, go ahead and check it out. The one reason why the album is said to have not been so successful, well, 2 reasons actually. One is that it was more or less split half and half. On the websites I read, they said side 1 was light and side 2 was fuzzy, but actually the track list on the CD, and which seems to match the track lists of albums I've checked on the internet, it's exactly light, fuzzy, light, fuzzy, light, fuzzy, light, fuzzy throughout the whole album there. So that does, I don't know, make it a little bit repetitious or predictable in a way. And another thing was that the band did not head off to New York or San Francisco like some of our other bands. They stayed in Bay Ridges. So around 1968, they folded up again. But anyway, Plastic Cloud, check it out if you're interested. And now another band we'll check out is called the Churros. So the Churros hit the Yorkville scene in Toronto in 1967. They had a different approach. They were very much inspired by the heavier, fuzzy sound of Cream and Jimi Hendrix, as well as that kind of boogie blues rock of the Rolling Stones. They got themselves an 8-week gig at the Penny Farthing Club, and I think it was during this time the Everly Brothers were passing through town, heard the band, and thought, "You guys are great." And so they got them hooked up with the management of Blood, Sweat and Tears, and soon after that, the Churros were off to New York. Later, they also headed over to California. It seems to be a common pattern for a lot of bands out there. But in New York, they started playing at a club called The Scene. In fact, they started playing there the day that they arrived. And The Scene was a place that gathered a lot of famous people in the music scene at the time. There was one time Lennon and McCartney showed up. Another time, Jimi Hendrix came on stage and played with the band at the end of their set. So they got to see a lot of famous people. Their first album, self-titled, was released in 1968, and it is a pretty cool album. Exactly. Some tracks, this more like Cream, Hendrix influence thing. In fact, one song on here even actually puts in the bass riff to Sunshine of Your Love for just one passage there. They also had some songs that were a little bit more of the boogie style. One of them called The Weeks Go By. Wow, it really sounds inspired by Jumpin' Jack Flash. In fact, I actually had to check the internet to see which came first, because it has happened on occasion that a Canadian band had a song that didn't really get anywhere big, but then a British band did a similar sounding song some years later and became very popular. However, Jumpin' Jack Flash was actually released in 1968 in May, so I'm going to say that it's probably the Churros showing their appreciation. That's why the song sounds so similar. But another really cool thing about this, the Churros have a song on this album called Timepiece, which is a slower, almost kind of ominous feeling, heavy psychedelic track. And when I heard it for the first time, I knew I'd heard that song somewhere before. And the reason why is because the heavy downer rock band from Texas, Blood Rock, recorded it on their debut album in 1970. So they covered the song by the Churros. How cool is that? If you're interested in that kind of thing, that heavy Cream and Stones and that kind of thing, you might want to check out this album here. This CD actually includes their second album, which was recorded a year later, featuring Lee Ashford on keyboard. It is a little bit more, I don't know, up with the times, I guess. It's moving more towards, I almost feel like it's heading towards that Hair or Jesus Christ Superstar, more like a theatrical type. But, it's still pretty cool. Just I like the first album a bit better. So do check them out, the Churros. Okay, let's see here. Next up, I believe we are going to get some Bent Wind. Here's Bent Wind's one and only album, Sussex, released in 1969. The band actually was formed by, Marty Roth and Jerry Gibbous. They actually formed a cover band around 1967, and then later on they changed their name to Road to Ruin and started writing original material. But after a bit they kind of parted ways, and Marty went and opened a second-hand store with a friend of his. And one day they heard some music being played from somewhere down the street. This was on Sussex Avenue, and it turned out that was Jerry playing the guitar, and so he invited Marty over and introduced them to the drummer and the bass player, and they started, jamming together, and they just hit it off. So they decided to form the band, and they decided they would only play original material. They called themselves Bent Wind because one time while Marty was playing a song that he'd written, Jerry was listening and he said, "You know what? Probably needs some fuzz tone or some wah-wah. It sounds like a bent wind." And so the name stuck. The band actually played a gig where there were 12 bands in 12 hours, and they were the first on. However, due to some technical problems, they didn't get to play until 45 minutes into their set, so they had only 15 minutes to play. So when their 15 minutes were up and they were told to leave the stage, they said, we got one more song. And it turned out to be a 12-minute song that was their loudest, featuring lots of guitar soloing and fuzz tone and all this. Now, as it happened, there was a guy named Merv Buchanan in the front row listening, and afterwards he approached the band and said, how would you guys like to do some recording? He was the owner of Trend Studios at that time, Trend Records. So the band went over and cut a single, A-side and B-side, and later on they cut a whole album there, which is this one here, Sussex. Now they printed off about 500 copies, sent some off to Sam the Record Man, sent some off to radio stations, and in the article that I read on the internet recently, It's Psychedelic Baby magazine, there was an interview with Marty Roth telling all about the band's history and his music history after. But I read somewhere else some years back, maybe when I first got this, that the band couldn't get played on the radio. And they went and asked one DJ, why are you not playing any of our songs? And he said, the album has too much hiss on it. We can't play this on the radio. And the band were devastated. Like, wow, we cut a whole album hoping to launch our careers, and now we find we can't get played because the production is too much hiss. And they went off to the park and started throwing their albums around like frisbees. Anyway, the band split up, and later on, Marty and Jerry got together, formed a cover band called the Lions. That existed for a short while. Then later on in the 70s, Marty was actually asked to do an album of children's songs. So there was an album called Marty, Matchstick and Friends, Fun Songs for Children. And later on, he actually wrote a rap jingle for Kool-Aid, for a Kool-Aid commercial. But because he was under contract, he lost all the rights to the songs. Kool-Aid kept everything. Bummer. So he went back to the secondhand store business, and one day a customer walked in and saw this album up on the wall and said, you've got a Bent Wind record. You know those things are going for several $100s now? Wow, that's a collector's item. So anyway, he decided to try to start up the band, but his former bandmates were not interested. Some of them just were not interested in playing. Some of them thought it was a joke that Bent Wind would actually get started again. So he put together a new band, and actually from the late 80s and into the 90s, they recorded another 3 albums. But anyway, that is Sussex, Bent Wind. Yes, there is some hiss on here. The sound is a little muddy, but it's pretty cool. There's some good hard rockin', heavy fuzz tone songs on here. A lot of fun. I don't know, one song in there you can hear like kind of shouting, like woo, you know, all this is really fun to listen to. There's also some bonus tracks on here, some songs which were not recorded as part of this album sessions. I think they were recorded sometime after, because the sound is just slightly more cleaner and more modern, but still has that late 60s, early 70s sound. But anyway, there you have it, Sussex. Okay, and I think it's time to do some collecting. So next up, we're going to look at the Collectors. The Collectors. They originally formed in 1961 as a house band for C-Fun Radio. They were called the C-Fun Classics. There were a number of lineup changes. They brought in Bill Henderson, Howie Vickers, Claire Lawrence, and some others. They changed their name to the Classics, and then they scored a recording contract with Valiant Records in the United States. So they headed down to California to record a couple of singles, which actually did rather well in Canada. And then they set about recording their first album, which is this one here, simply called The Collectors, which came out in 1968. Interesting thing about the band's name, they had dropped the Classics name, but they didn't have a new name when they were down recording their singles. And so their rep for the record company said, you guys need a name. The Collectors or The Collection, pick one. So they went with The Collectors. Anyway, for their first album here, side 1 is 5 tracks showing the versatility of the band. We've got some lighter songs, we've got some heavier. Howard Chrisman's Older is actually a kind of one of those, I don't know, almost unsettling type stories of this guy who works almost like miracle powers. And yeah, a little bit more of the heavy psychedelic type. I really like it. But there was one track called Lydia Purple, which was actually not written by the band. And in fact, some session musicians came in to play harpsichord and recorder for it. And the band said, this song does not represent us. This is not what we want on the album. But the record company said, no, this is going to be a single. It's going to be a hit. You're putting it on the album. So what could they do? Anyway, side 2 is an incredible thing. It is called What Love Sweet, and it is over 19 minutes long. Now, there's an interesting thing, a quote from inside the notes inside here. I've got on the computer, I'm going to read it out. Bill Henderson says, Claire Lawrence, Claire, I guess he had a life experience and came up with these themes and some lyrics. He came over to my unit in this motel where we were staying, and we took it to a full arrangement, basically overnight. We wrote everything out on manuscript paper, because we were literate musicians, where the breakdowns were, what the riffs were, the dynamics. No one wrote dynamics in rock, but we did. Where we wanted crescendos and diminuendos to happen, where things would slow down, where they'd speed up, and everybody's parts. I think this is really incredible because the way they approached composing that song is the way I think Yes went about composing their sidelong epics in the 1970s. So here we have basically a 60s rock band, psychedelic band, composing a sidelong epic suite with many, many parts. Until this time, most sidelong epics that were out there, which were very few to begin with, were basically jam sessions, a song with an extended instrumental break in it. But this is actually composed in parts and played out all together, and they did actually perform the whole thing live as well. So that's really cool. They recorded one more album in 1969, and then Howie Wickers, the vocalist, left, and so the remaining four members changed the name to Chilliwack, and from 1970 they began releasing albums under the name of Chilliwack. Then during the 1970s they had a lot of hits like She Talks Crazy Talk, Fly at Night, My Girl, Gone Gone Gone, and that goes into the 1980s now, and also What You Gonna Do. They had several hit songs in Canada and even appeared on Dick Clark's American Bandstand in the US. Anyway, that was Chilliwack. This is The Collectors. I think their first album is quite interesting, and do check out Howard Chrisman's Older. There is a video for Lydia Purple. It was a promotion video that was filmed on the top of the Palisades Hotel in Vancouver. You can find that on YouTube. And yeah, What Love Sweet. Do check that one out too. Okay, those are the 8 bands that I wanted to talk about originally. However, one of the newer bands, I want to mention them because they are not really garage rock or heavy psychedelic. They are a very light psychedelic band. However, there's something special about them, so I do want to mention them. Evil grows in me. This is the Poppy Family. This is a collection of songs. It's called A Good Thing Lost. This includes songs from their first album, as well from their second, and I guess some singles and stuff as well. Plus, after they dropped the name The Poppy Family, some of the songs that were recorded just under the name of Susan Jacks, I think. Now, Susan Jacks is the singer on here. Terry Jacks was actually her husband. He played rhythm guitar, vocals, backing vocals, and wrote songs. Then they also had Craig McCaw, who played a rhythm and lead guitar. I think he also did some keys as well. And then a sitar, he played sitar. And then Satwant Singh, they had playing tabla and as well some other percussion. So they did have that kind of Indian sound. Now they had that big hit with Which Way You Goin' Billy. When I heard that, I knew I'd heard that song before. But they've also got some pretty cool songs like Where Evil Grows, I think it's called. And another one called There's No Blood in Bone. So it's a pretty lightweight band. It's almost a little bit country and folkish at times, maybe similar to the Carpenters, but some of the lyrics are a little bit on the heavy side, actually. But anyway, the reason why I'm mentioning the Poppy Family is because when I listened to them on YouTube a couple of weeks back, I really liked Susan Jacks's voice, and Susan Jacks's voice, not Susan Jackson. Susan Jacks's voice, and I thought, well, maybe I'll check them out a little bit more. And then I found out that Susan Jacks actually, this is in May, so I was doing this. April 25th of this year, 2022, Susan Jacks passed away from kidney failure. She was waiting for a donor. She'd already had one kidney donated, and now she was waiting for another one, and then her condition just got worse, and she passed away very sadly. But even more surprising to me was she passed away in the local hospital that I went to when I was growing up, which was Surrey Memorial Hospital in Surrey, British Columbia. Turns out Susan was born in Saskatchewan, but her family moved to the Fraser Valley of British Columbia when she was young. They started out living out in Haney, which is a place where I went out and photographed before in the early 90s. And then, yeah, she was basically in the greater Vancouver area. And I'm not sure where she lived near the end, but it seems that she spent her final days in Surrey Memorial Hospital. So that was kind of shocking to me. And yeah, she passed away. And I think, you know, the album's called A Good Thing Lost. That's kind of, you know, what, coincidental, I guess, or prophetic, because now we're thinking Susan's gone. But anyway, I wanted to mention the Poppy family specifically for that. Okay, so that wraps up the video part 1. In part 2, I'm going to take a look at some other of those heavy psychedelic bands coming around the late 60s and even maybe touching 70, 71 a bit. So please do watch that. It's probably going to come up in a couple of weeks. For now, thanks a lot for watching this one. Hope you'll check out some of those bands if you're interested, and catch you next time. All right, everyone. Stay safe. Take care. See you in the next one.